966.
Joining us now on the 966, Dr. Qanta Ahmed, physician, nonfiction author, broadcast media commentator, and writer. Dr. Qanta's got an amazing CV. She's an academic pulmonologist and sleep disorder specialist at NYU Langone in New York. She's an author and writer whose articles, columns, and opinions have been published in over 16 major market news outlets across the world. Dr. Qanta has lived in and visited Saudi Arabia now for a period spanning over 3 decades. She first visited Saudi Arabia as a single female doctor in 1999 and wrote a book called In the Land of Invisible Women. Since then, she's personally seen the changes ongoing in the kingdom in recent years since the launch of Vision 2030, and in recent months, indeed as well, visiting Saudi Arabia as the guest of the Muslim World League and at the invitation of Secretary General Dr. Muhammad Ali Soleimani. Dr. Qanta, we're very excited to be speaking with you. Thank you for joining us on the 966. It's a pleasure.
It's an absolute privilege. So excited to be with the 966.
Oh, the privilege is ours. Thank you so much. You've been very patient. We finally get you on, and this is exciting. And let's just jump right into it. Lucian's introduction's terrific, as they always are.
Thank you.
We were laughing beforehand, Qanta, about your sort of inadvertent longitudinal study of Saudi Arabia,
Right.
Going back to 1999. Can you take us to the beginning, and discuss your initial encounter? What drew you to this engagement? And what were your impressions in 1999?
Richard, thank you so much for this question. Actually, I was thinking about this deeply today. Even the name of your podcast, 966, brings back so much nostalgia because, of course, I had a home phone number beginning with 966, and my home phone number was an extension of the National Guard Hospital. It was $4 a minute to call the United States from Riyadh. And today as I was preparing for our talk, one of the first memories I have is of the incredible silence. I was driven by what we call euphemistically limo drivers. Being a single woman, there was no driving permitted for women in 1999. So if I went anywhere, Zachariah, my Egyptian Christian driver, would take me. And we were sitting at a traffic light right outside of the National Guard Hospital, which at the time was situated near where the football stadium was. And there was nothing else there. There was just a football stadium and a hospital. Nobody lived out there. Riyadh had not really progressed to that area. And just sitting at the traffic light, you could hear the crackle of a radio in a neighboring car when you had the window open. And recently coming back from Saudi Arabia at the Saudi Media Forum in February, just the scale of the activity, the expansion, the development, the energy, the fact that Saudi Arabia truly is rocking so many sectors of international trade, sports, politics, energy. I just can't even begin to put into words the colossal change that I've been able to see in these 30 years. It's really, really hard for anybody who's not experienced that to understand how it's gone from a place that was really very important from an Islamic standpoint, but so unknown to most of the planet. And here we are with the podcast, the most listened to in the English language, beginning with the area code that was once dialing in to speak to me. Marvelous.
That is a trip down memory lane, and so many things are different. So when you leaves you that words, in fact, you wrote a book that has sold very well in multiple countries as a result of your experience, and sort of as a starting point, a benchmark. This book, In the Land of Invisible Women, you came out of your experience and you wrote this book. What was your take at that time on Saudi Arabia?
Well, I went there absolutely ignorant of Saudi Arabia. And because I was just on the threshold of 30 or just having turned 30, a highly trained critical care physician, felt that I knew probably most things that I needed to know. I was raised as a Muslim woman by Pakistani migrants in Britain. I knew Islam. I didn't do any preparation. Right before leaving JFK to go to Riyadh, there was a magazine rack in the airport, and I saw a picture of a Saudi gentleman, and it was a Forbes magazine profiling Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. And I thought, well, you know, he's from Saudi Arabia. Let me read the magazine on the way over. I'll learn something about Saudi Arabia. And then I practiced medicine. And when I practiced medicine, it was high on octane, full on steroids, critical care with better equipment, more resources, more capabilities, and in many ways, more sophistication than the critical care medicine I'd left in New York City in 1999. But outside of that, nothing was comprehensible to me as a Muslim woman. And that was what was the astonishing, jarring shock. And bear in mind, I arrived on Thanksgiving Day in 1999. The world was preparing for Y2K. That was the biggest anxiety, that maybe whatever limited digitalization we had then would collapse on January 1st. So that was the environment. And when I left Saudi Arabia, it happened to be in time with avoiding another contract rolling into the next year. So I'd taken an elective resignation. I'd circled in my diary the date that I would hand in my resignation letter. I think it's very important. People should resign at least once in their life. It's an important thing to do. And I came home and turned on the television and watched NBC Today and saw September 11th. And so those two events, Y2K and September 11th, are essentially the parentheses on my time at that point. And when I came back to New York City, which was my origin in the United States, you could still smell what was happening at ground zero. Ultimately, those survivors are now my patients. Decades later, I look after people that have survived that. I realized that I'd been on a journey in medicine. I had made the Hajj. I had been in the journey inside my own relationship with Islam. And I'd been to a place that most people in the West completely misunderstood and did not know. And underneath all of that orthodoxy that all of us lived through, whether we were British American expats, whether we were European Muslims or Saudis ourselves, we were all subject to the yoke of Wahhabi neo-Orthodox fundamentalism that most Saudis themselves did not subscribe to and were very oppressed. I did not choose the name of my book. This was a choice made by the publisher, and I objected to it severely because I felt the women were not invisible. Men were just as marginalized by the ideology as women. And it was a great restriction on all humanity, that form of neo-Orthodoxy that outsiders like us might refer to as Wahhabism. And from there, we now see the tremendous blossoming, including in how Islam is expressed in Saudi Arabia, not only the movement of women, but it's really been an amazing journey. And so that journey around the time of 9/11 is when I began to think about writing it. It took almost 6 or 7 years to get published.
That's fascinating. First of all, full marks and compliments for the courage and the initiative just to go.
Yep.
That's a courageous thing to do. Most people don't do it, especially single women. And obviously you're an accomplished professional in any number of other ways, involved with any significant initiatives outside of your profession. But this is sort of a foundational leap that you took, and I think that's really impressive. Second of all, I think it's really interesting that that choice of Land of Invisible Women, because both Lucia and I will attest, and I know you absolutely could speak to this. Some of the most impressive women I've ever met are in Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
And I also agree with you that as we were talking beforehand, Qanta, I had been there, first went there in the early 80s, this latent urge, both male and female, to expand their existence and that of their country. Obviously they're proud and Saudis, happy to be Saudis, but they understand what their environment is and how it can be improved and why it had gotten to the situation was when you were first there. So let's jump to what prompted you to re-engage with Saudi Arabia.
So, in fact, after I left the kingdom, I continued to come back at the invitation of my academic colleagues at the National Guard, Health Affairs, They have remained, some of them tremendous colleagues, one of them very acclaimed expert in infectious disease internationally, Dr. Ziad Memish. We have written dozens of papers together about Hajj medicine. We wrote some of the sentinel academic papers on that field. And so there were academic pursuits that kept me visiting. And I never stopped following the kingdom, but I deepened my interest after realizing there is a different kind of Islam that I'm not familiar with, realizing that there were some perpetrators that did not represent Saudis, did not represent Muslims, called themselves Muslims and perpetrated Islamist jihadism. I took almost a decade and a half, pursued understanding Islamist jihadism, and began visiting the region elsewhere, particularly to the state of Israel. And when I started to visit Israel, I felt there may not be a way to come back, even though I was never impugned by the kingdom, I didn't experience any retaliation. Nobody said that to me. So I sort of circumnavigated the kingdom for those years. And I still, whenever possible, wanted to set the record straight about the true Saudi kingdom, even before Vision 2030 came into being. And that was because I see this constant stereotype, which predates September 11th. I grew up as a young child when there was this whole scandal in Britain and in the Western press surrounding the concept of death of a princess. And if it's not that, it's some other issue. And if it's not that, it's Islamist jihadists. We can say Osama bin Laden, who, by the way, was stripped of his Saudi citizenship. And Saudi Arabia was the first nation to warn the United States about this movement. All those things are lost in translation. And so I was always very concerned that people understand the true Saudis. And the true Saudis I had the privilege of knowing was not just my very well-heeled colleagues who'd trained in Canada and the United States, including men and women who were Saudis, but the grandmothers and the mothers of the National Guard soldiers who were my patients. These were Bedouin women and Bedouin men. Many of them were not literate in Arabic, who welcomed me when I was looking after their family member, would bring me boxes of fresh dates from their farms. Sometimes they would shyly grab my hand and wipe incense or attar on my hand as a gift. Absolutely thrilled that I was a woman doctor, thrilled that I was a Muslim, and thrilled I was from the United States. This is a side of Saudi Arabia that people still don't see. Even Saudis today don't know it. And one thing I've learned almost 38 years after I went to medical school is being a physician is such a unique vantage and privilege. A human being in front of me puts their trust in me to help them with their health, whatever aspect it might be, physical or psychological or other. And there is an unveiling of humanity that when you meet as doctor and patient, you understand profoundly about the society in which you engage. And that's true of Saudi Arabia. That's true of the United States. And while I've been following the kingdom, I have been looking with great concern as to what is happening to my chosen place of living, New York or the United States, in comparison to Saudi Arabia. And it's this widening chasm that has me actually very worried about the United States as I see Saudi Arabia moving into sectors and into a mindset that is so profoundly American. And yet, while we're in America, we are losing that mindset, whether it's medicine, whether it's industry, whether it's family values, whether it's faith. There are so many contrasts and so much to gain by looking at ourselves through the reflection of our relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia.
Maybe we can, and I'm not sure I'm going to properly phrase this, so help me out. One of the things we've discovered in doing this show, and I think maybe we knew it intuitively, but so when we would talk with artists or in entrepreneurs or anybody, what you discover was this talent, this drive, this passion, this hope, all existed pre-Vision 2030. It was there. And this is what you're saying, I think. You know, there so much of this was there. So, but clearly, so much of this population, Saudi population, has embraced the Vision 2030. It's now their working paradigm, how they go about things, what they think is possible. Can you talk, maybe share your perspective on what are the most striking changes? And I want our listeners, and I hope you'll agree, to understand that yes, there's striking changes, but this sentiment, this drive, it's been there.
Yes. So you mentioned about meeting women from Saudi Arabia and how extraordinary they are. And of course, we come from a society where there are tremendous opportunities for women here in the United States. And so very early on, I had very few female colleagues. I was appointed there at a level essentially as a consultant in critical care medicine. I was the first woman in that healthcare system to provide critical care. I trained the first women in that country in critical care medicine, and that is high stakes medicine. But the isolated female colleagues I had, some of them were from extraordinarily privileged backgrounds. They had no need to ever earn a living. They had no need to venture into difficult, challenging medicine where everything can go wrong, but they had a great appetite for it. They were surgically skilled. They would go overseas to seek higher training at a time when travel was considered actually also a matter of family honor if a woman is traveling away from her family. And they did it surrounded by male colleagues who many of them were extremely supportive to me, but culturally may have been hesitant to show that support to a fellow Saudi woman. So I saw them as pioneers. One of my most esteemed colleagues, and I've not seen her for some years, but she's made a huge impact on me, Dr. Maha Al-Manif, was with me attending critically ill children, some of whom came in dire circumstances where we were concerned about their situation at home. She went on to found the first shelters for women at risk and children at risk in the kingdom. And how do you build shelters for those that might be subject to domestic abuse, domestic violence, which affects all societies? You go in person in your abaya and you speak at every courthouse to every judge. And you do so well before these circumstances where there's such freedom and such integration in society. So the amount of courage, and she had actually the sponsorship of King Abdullah and one of King Abdullah's daughters. So the king himself supported these movements over 15 to 20 years ago. Very few people know that. I dedicated a chapter in my book about that. Similarly, you would have women that were some of the first obstetricians, women that were some of the first nutritionists. One of them, Dr. Dua Hamuda, created some of the first franchises in organic restaurants. As I was leaving, the kingdom was beginning to do that. So they had an entrepreneurial spirit from the start. And so they have always had this sentiment of drive, and you have to survive in that kind of environment where the climate, the irrigation, the fact that the kingdom historically was the center of so many paths of merchants from Africa all the way up to the Levant. So they have had this in them for centuries. And it's wonderful that people can see their drive, their imagination, but also their deep sense of national pride. And the reason I'm struck by that on recent visits is because we're really beginning to see an erosion in our sense of nationhood and our love for our fellow citizen in the United States. And actually, even more striking than what I've seen in Saudi Arabia is when I am in Saudi Arabia and I turn and I look westwards, and now I'm able to see the United States from a distance. That's where I see the chasm between where they are going and where we are slipping away.
We've talked about that on the 966, and I think certainly. So, for example, the Arab Barometer talks about attitudes. One of the broadest survey of public opinion, and one of the issues for the U.S. in terms of how it's perceived in the region is credibility, and a lot of that has to do with how we're behaving at home. But let's talk about. You describe Saudi Arabia as a maturing G20 nation. This is an important theme. Can you expand on that and tell us what you mean by that?
Well, I think, and perhaps it's coming from a bias where I see how Saudi Arabia is reported on news in sound bites without an understanding that Saudi Arabia is integral to not only the BRICS nations. Saudi Arabia is historically the epicenter of Islam, and the Muslim majority world looks to Saudi Arabia for leadership. Additionally, we have two of the most populous countries in the world, Pakistan and Indonesia, that are now rivaling one another for the highest number of Muslims, not counting the number of Muslims that are in India. The entire fulcrum of population and subsequent generations, the growth of Islam, the trade and economics that happens in that region of the world means that Saudi Arabia is a central kingpin in many of the decisions made, whatever the issues are being discussed. But I think two instances were most striking to me. And I was in Saudi Arabia in October last year and also February this year. Shortly after I was back in October, we had an OPEC decision made that the United States did not like, an OPEC plus decision made, which the United States commentators felt was deliberately to sabotage or undermine U.S. interests with this unfolding conflict between Russia and Ukraine to do with energy pricing. And failure to report how that is a global decision, and I know you have other commentators speaking about energy, in addition to failure to mention the Saudi Arabian government that had played a critical role in the release of hostages held by Russia, including American citizens. That was sort of vanished and not reported, made me understand that there is an expectation to engage with Saudi Arabia, not on an equal plane. Now, the United States is a tremendous superpower. Saudi Arabia is a huge petrochemical power. There's not an equivalence. But Saudi Arabia is no longer a nation that will provide energy on its bidding of the 20th century. It is a very important influencer that is rightly maintaining its neutrality in, for instance, this extremely troubling conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And so for Saudi Arabia to be able to use its relationships that it's built through almost 80 years of engaging in energy with, for instance, Russia, is only to the benefit of the West. And yet it is portrayed and villainized and demonized for maintaining neutrality. And I think I see this again and again. There's no understanding of its role in the G20. There's no understanding Saudi Arabia is becoming extremely sophisticated in areas of diplomacy outside of energy. There's a traditional thinking of oil for security as the only engagement with the West. That is not correct. And I also think there's been tremendous bias, which has been perpetuated for various interests to portray negatively the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Muhammad bin Salman, which serves certain narratives, which means that the West does not look at Saudi Arabia intelligently or truly deeply or critically. It's much easier to caricature a country that you don't want to understand deeply, maybe because you fear that the country is changing, is maturing, is becoming more sophisticated. And it's much easier to think about it without nuance, in tandem with old tropes. Now, I'm aware that you are a co-founder of the Saudi-US Trade Group, and you have very sophisticated understandings, and this is not denigrating my adoptive nation. I'm a very proud naturalized American, but we could do a lot better. And I think we have a great deal to learn from how Saudi Arabia manages these issues. Another example I'll give you. In September 2020, I was privileged to be on the South Lawn in the White House during the signing of the Abraham Accords. And that was historic and momentous, and I think was a tremendous contribution to the nations in the region the United States. I think it's very important, and I'm a strong advocate for the Abraham Accords. And there's been a constant drumbeat as to when Saudi Arabia will become a party and a participant, and how Saudi Arabia could be drawn into this, as if the kingdom could or operates on inducements or in a transactional capacity, and not as an entity creating and engaging in a vision and direction of its own making. I do, in fact, believe Saudi Arabia, and I have no access to any diplomats, so I'm just speculating. I absolutely do believe Saudi Arabia will eventually become a treaty to this agreement. I do believe Saudi Arabia will work with the surrounding region to stabilize the intensely, deeply fissured conflict between Israel and Palestine. I think that's to everybody's advantage, but Saudi Arabia will do it on its own terms. Saudi Arabia will probably lead those negotiations with the Arab world. And this is where I think the United States has become somewhat fossilized and somewhat stuck in a 20th century mindset, when the 21st century shows us how this region, and the kingdom in particular, is rewriting the script.
I think that's well said, and I think it speaks to a regular theme here on the 966, and there's so much to unwrap there. Certainly, we have advocated for a very long time that the U.S. updates, firstly, its administration and opinion leaders and people who are making decisions within the administration, update, revamp its understanding of Saudi Arabia and the relationship. I will say, that October event, the OPEC decision, coming on the heels of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022, and was received as I think it was what do we called it? Brouhaha, but it was a firestorm. That's what we've called it.
Yes.
Because it was during an election in November. And I would say, and I want to move on actually to another question, but I would say that the communication, the understanding, the relationship has actually progressed positively since then, in part because of that, and that we're actually in a better position now, not where we want to be, but it also doesn't speak to what you're saying, that America prefers its tropes, and there is very little nuance, which I think is something we're trying to get to here. But there's a very important thing that you got there, and this is how Saudi Arabia, in a variety of ways, influences the world. And in particular, you mentioned Pakistan and Indonesia, and also India as significant Muslim populations who pay close attention to Saudi Arabia. One of the things that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been, is a key pillar of Vision 2030, is a rediscovery and a promotion of a moderate Islam. And he would say, as many people around him would say, this is not a moderate Islam. This is original Islam, which is inherently moderate. So, it had been co-opted, hijacked. We are trying to recover this and be, in their minds, proper Muslims. A major important vehicle of this is the Muslim World League. And
absolutely.
Dr. Muhammad Ali Soleimani, who currently is in India at this moment. And he has been extremely active in taking this message forward, embodying this message. He visited Holocaust museums, and he's been sort of the figurehead for moderation. Can you talk a little bit about the Muslim World League and Dr. Muhammad?
My pleasure. In fact, it was extraordinarily stunning to me that one of his advisors, Dr. Haya Al-Jadua, contacted me after I was speaking about the Saudi Arabia on Newsmax. And I spoke about it's absolutely unfair to demonize the kingdom in some other context. President Biden had been visiting Saudi Arabia at the time. And she asked me to come to the kingdom and meet Dr. Muhammad Ali. So, and I said, well, that's very nice. I'm not sure who he is. And by the way, I've spent almost a dozen trips to Israel, and maybe you're not going to be able to have me. And I've lost most of my Saudi friends because they've called me a Zionist. And she starts laughing. And I'm thinking, well, obviously she doesn't know what a Zionist is when it's said in a not respectful way. And she said, no, you don't understand. She said, Dr. Alisa has been to Auschwitz. He is led the most senior delegation of Muslims to pray in Auschwitz. He's named the Holocaust is a crime against humanity. He just gave the sermon at Mecca, and I had read about his sermon in the New York Times. So a few months later, I was there at his Riyadh offices in a private meeting with him that was off the record, but I've been able to write about it and disclose a lot of what we discussed. I just was astounded, not only by his intellect. We had a translator. I'm not fluent in Arabic. I can read Arabic, but I can't converse in Arabic. His translator actually speaks fluent Urdu. And so we spoke in English. I spoke in English. He spoke in Arabic. And our short meeting turned into almost 4 hours, where we discussed Islamism. One of the first things Dr. Alisa talked to me about was his fears about the Russia-Ukraine war. And could we imagine that we have two Christian nations at war with one another, using the language of holy war? Because, of course, Putin had been speaking about his very fire-breathing Orthodox Christian leader. I forget the name of his Christian priest that's very pro the conflict, and Zelensky had been speaking about Ukrainian soldiers being lost as martyrs. And so this language, in the context of Saudi Arabia's experience with the sharp end of Islamist jihadism in a terrible way, just immediately revealed to me what a deep thinker Dr. Alisa is. His experience of Islam and his values that he is able to expose to the world are exactly the Islam in which I was raised, which then came to such brutal collisions with the state-enforced orthodoxy that I had encountered 23 years ago. And there's so many things that Dr. Alisa is doing. The most important that he's done recently is author a document called the Charter of Mecca, which was made public in 2019. And it extols, I think, about 15 tenets, which include there can be no compulsion in faith. Every creed has its place. There is more than one route to our Maker. There can be no prejudice or racism in the name of religion. The importance of environmental stewardship, the importance of preserving human dignity. And these are not just sayings, these are now becoming implementations in various programs. And I was just at one of the first meetings in London with European Muslim leaders. But even more than his work in that capacity, we recently met with him here at the United Nations when he was bringing an interfaith dialogue into the United Nations in New York City. It is also the fact that Dr. Alisa is so deeply supported by the Saudi monarchy, by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and how skillfully and expertly the yoke or the mantle of neo-Orthodox fundamentalism has been lifted from Saudi Arabia, and therefore from legitimacy through the Muslim world to allow true Islam to engage without violence, without upheaval, without revolution. And that has been done by introducing new thinkers with true pluralist values in Islam, engaging in dialogue, whereby at one of the Muslim world meetings in London, I was able to meet a leading Shia cleric who has been recognized by the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia and who is calling for engagement between Sunnis and Shias inside the kingdom, where Shias can now provide the literature on their religious values in the kingdom in a way to not marginalize and isolate different believers into silos where hostilities can breed. And this is absolutely lost on Western commentators. And this can only happen because these are the values of King Salman, and these are the values of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who one day will become king. This could never happen only with the intellect of Dr. Muhammad Ali Soleimani. Dr. Muhammad Ali Soleimani is not just Secretary General of the Muslim World League, which, as you know, is international. It is not a Saudi organization. It was founded in Mecca, but it is an international organization with a Supreme Council of about 60 members from different Muslim majority countries. That is the giant hub that rotates the 1.6 billion Muslims around the world. And that's why the influence of Dr. Ali Soleimani represents the sentiment and philosophy of the apex of the Saudi kingdom. And that is why it's so extraordinary.
Dr. Qanta, you have visited Saudi Arabia in several capacities, professional capacity, as a tourist and as someone who has performed the Hajj. You're also an academic expert on Hajj medicine. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Well, you know, we wrote some of the earliest papers in English, not the first, because part of our papers, I went to the British Library and dug up from the 19th century archives from British medical literature of what was said about the Muslim pilgrimage when Muslims, we were referred to as Mohammedans in academic papers. But we did realize that there is a remarkable challenge in managing humanity in the pilgrimage. And in fact, this may actually tie into all of the themes we've just been talking about, where we have to perform these rituals. When I performed the Hajj, by the grace of God, it was the year 2000. And that year, if I remember correctly, about 2.2 million people or 2.5 million people were engaging in the Hajj. Remember, really very few cell phones. I didn't have a cell phone. There was not Wi-Fi everywhere. There were so many aspects in technology that we didn't have. And yet 2.5 million people can complete this ritual, which is in a number of days in very confined circumstances. And that happens because of the Islamic principle: when you're in Hajj, you can bear no ill to anybody. You cannot lose your temper. You cannot bring a weapon anywhere close to that area. The only way humanity can engage and complete Hajj is through cooperation. And that is the metaphor of Hajj. We say in Islam, when you are conducting Hajj, you are presenting yourself to meet your maker in this lifetime. That is what we believe. And you go to Hajj only by invitation. And my invitation came in a very strange way right after we had saved the life of a critically ill young girl who was 14. And a colleague said to me, look, why don't you go to Hajj? Because you never know when you'll be here again. And that was my invitation. I had no previous intention to do that. And that metaphor of putting your own needs behind those of maybe the elderly person next to you, maybe the disabled person, maybe the baby, maybe whoever may be conducting that alongside you in crowds of millions, tolerating temperature, tolerating proximity, tolerating thirst. That metaphor for cooperation is something that greatly determines the philosophy of the kingdom. We can talk about the health risks. I mean, Saudi Arabia's developed a unique expertise in managing epidemics, pandemics, mass gatherings, heat exposure, dehydration, respiratory infections, whether masks were useful. I mean, all of that. And the experts in Hajj, there's a Ministry of Hajj, the experts in Hajj health now inform the Olympics, and they inform the World Cup, and they inform American inaugurations. Much more important than that is the Hajj happens every year, and there is a 9-month lead time to prepare for a 3-month Hajj season. And that event is bigger than the Olympics happening annually, involving Muslims from 193 countries and their governments. So if you have Ebola in Uganda, you have to now plan for what's going to happen to the Ugandan Muslims. If you have a conflict with a neighboring nation, let's say Ukraine or sometimes Iran, how are you going to manage these pilgrims. Saudi Arabia has been engaging in global diplomacy with the Hajj at its epicenter for its entire existence. And that gives it remarkable skill and remarkable humility. Because, for instance, most moving to me was how Saudi Arabia managed the pandemic. Do you know Saudi Arabia was one of the very first nations to close its borders in February 2020, I think February 25th, 2020. Saudi Arabia immobilized its own population from going to pilgrimage, which is a very heartbreaking decision for the kingdom to make, because the kingdom knows it is the guardian, the custodian of the two holiest cities. And eventually Saudi Arabia had a very, very pared down pilgrimage, including in 2020. If you look at the pictures, and I published an article about this in The Spectator in London, the images are truly balletic, like ballet, in a completely massive religious complex. People were distanced, people were protected, and just a handful of people were able to complete that. And little by little, they expanded it out to the world. That indicates to you the gravity and seriousness with which Saudi Arabia takes its role as the protector for the holiest sites for billions of humanity. And that's a responsibility that no other country in the world faces. And then when Richard spoke about Pakistan, we're extremely worried. I'm from a Pakistani family, about the stability and future of Pakistan. And next to Pakistan, Afghanistan, whose name is almost never mentioned. We know that we've had 2 decades of military and political solutions presented to Afghanistan that ended in abject failure with the Taliban now at the helm. How are we going to reach these communities other than through a language and dialogue of dismantling fundamentalism and enabling the blossoming of pluralist Islam? There is no Western diplomat that has that capability. And I'm not suggesting that that's Saudi Arabia's intention or its plan or an undertaking, but the method or the blueprint to remove neo-fundamentalism that oppresses men and women, that blueprint has been very clearly demonstrated in Saudi Arabia. It is not the way we're seeing the protests in Iran, and hence my recent essay. It is absolutely through skillful empowering of pluralist voices, which the kingdom has been doing steadily for years. And Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is greatly to be credited for catalyzing that and propagating that and taking the heat for that, because this is why the country is coming along.
They're also using AI now to manage the Hajj, which is interesting. You were recently in Saudi Arabia in February at the Saudi Media Forum. You talked about Saudi Arabia, the importance of Saudi Arabia investing in AI and AI systems because they're based on learned information. And you discussed the future of AI, and you said, and this is from Arab News, unless Saudi Arabia embraces AI from the outset, we are going to see an expanded bias that we are already seeing in the English language written media, which often promotes ancient stereotypes. Can you talk a little bit about that as well? I think that's super interesting. And we know Saudi Arabia is interested in AI. They're using it for the Hajj, but can you expand on that just a little bit? That's fascinating.
So, it's funny because we were talking about AI this morning in medicine, and it is, I think it's extremely fascinating. It is extremely important that we get to engage with AI and put in the correct level of investment and education so that we are not locked out of this next technological shift. It would be, for instance, watching the computer revolution without having access to a PC or a Mac. So we cannot have a country like Saudi Arabia be locked out. And especially when Saudi Arabia is at the apex of the Muslim world, where so much of the Muslim majority world is still not literate in its basic language, let alone literate in its religion. The reason I said that in the column and also at the media forum is because of exactly what we've just been talking about. And in fact, you at 966 are building precisely the kind of nuance and insight that is available almost nowhere else, unless you're in a little dinner party with people that have seasoned experience with Saudi Arabia. And I may not be really so seasoned. And what I'm worried about is if we're using AI English language platforms in Saudi Arabia, but almost all of the English language commentary about Saudi Arabia has not been written by Saudis, has not even been written by Westerners that travel to Saudi. All those media commentators, when they refer to the October OPEC decision-making as the firestorm that Richard mentioned, I'd expect that almost none of them had ever traveled, let alone lived in the kingdom or been amongst a Saudi family or really understood that industry from a level of intimacy to give them true perspective. Saudi Arabia needs to command not only its own sectors in trade and tourism and religious tourism and recreational tourism. They need to increase their English language footprint, whether it is a media outlet that may rival and one day supersede Al Jazeera, whether it is many more newspapers of the stature of the Arab News, which is a remarkably valuable platform, which we used to read in the 1990s. It came in a green paper version. There was no digital version.
Known as the Green Truth.
The Green Truth, yes. And so, but that will require English language facility in Saudi journalism, English language facility in Saudi cable. It needs Saudis who can write their own story in our language, not only their language. And I think they're just beginning to envision their story. I want to say one thing before we end, and I sense that we may be getting close to the end. And when I talk about being in Riyadh and looking eastwards and thinking about New York City, what I'm actually looking at is our younger generation. And the overwhelming feeling I got on returning to Saudi Arabia, apart from meeting the extraordinary colleagues at the Muslim World League, Dr. Muhammad Ali Soleimani, is the vibrance and the energy and the enthusiasm of the younger generation. When I first lived in Saudi Arabia, I couldn't believe I'd never seen so many Cadillacs and Mercedes-Benz and GMCs in one place ever. And I had also never seen so much black worn other than in New York. So I remember that vividly. But now what I noticed when I was being driven around in a beautiful, automobile somebody provided me, is the number of Mazdas and the number of Suzukis and the number of Mini Coopers. The surge of a middle class in Saudi Arabia, which was so amazing. People were in their modest cars. There was a rush hour. They were busy going somewhere because they had to go to work, or they were going shopping, or they were going to an entertainment venue, or they were going on a vacation. That mobility and that energy and that entire class of people did not exist when I lived there. We had the professionals, the diplomats, the soldiers, the doctors, the dentists. We had the National Guard. We had very few academics, and we had people that were impoverished, the Bedouins and the rural farm workers. But now there is a huge army of middle class, and that is the focus of the kingdom. And that intense focus, how are we going to educate them? How are we going to feed them? How are we going to meet their sustainable energy needs? How are we going to keep them from becoming indoctrinated by some new fundamentalism or some new radicalization? And when I come back to the United States, I treat patients that are of that age, or we have friends and family with people of that age. And I see the lack of direction and the lack of aspiration and the lack of hope and the lack of national focus on our youth. And that's the huge contrast.
We are unfortunately running short on time, Dr. Qanta. This has been absolutely marvelous. One last question, I promise, a short one. What's next for you? What's on the horizon for you?
Well, what a great question. In fact, in terms of in terms of this, I'm very interested in learning and speaking more about international religious freedom. I've been very concerned about the effects of Islamism, political Islam, and how it has limited the rights and freedoms of people who are Christian, people who are Yazidi, and people who are pluralist Muslims. That's why I'm so invigorated to see the Saudi Kingdom and the Muslim World League take such a strong position against extremism and particularly Islamist ideology. And so I'm hoping to be able to go back to Iraq, where I visited on 3 occasions to post-ISIS regions in northern Iraq, and see how our efforts there are unfolding with the Yazidi community. This is a community that I would like Saudi Arabia to take an interest in, is these people that have been left behind after conflict, and they're still in refugee camps 7 years later. There have been elections won on defeating ISIS here in the United States, but our Yazidi refugees do not have water, they do not have air conditioning, they do not have schools. Similarly, the veterans that fought those wars, the Peshmerga, their children don't have a future. So this part very much concerns me. And the other part is, you mentioned AI. I'm very interested in how AI is going to influence American medicine, particularly my discipline of sleep medicine. I'm very heavily engaged in advancing neurostimulation in sleep medicine. And in fact, speaking to colleagues about hopefully coming and speaking at a sleep medicine conference in Saudi Arabia. So maybe there will be finally a way that I can join my academic sleep practice and my amateur foreign policy interests into Riyadh. I think that would be great.
Inshallah, that'd be amazing. Dr. Qanta Ahmed, physician, nonfiction author, broadcast media commentator, writer, one of our favorite guests on the 966. Now we can add that to your CV. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been marvelous.
Absolute pleasure.